My name is Emma. I'm in my mid-30s now, and for most of my adult life, I was the kind of person people describe as steady, the dependable one, the calm presence in a room. I worked a normal job, paid my bills on time, remembered birthdays, and showed up when things were inconvenient. If you asked my family or friends who I was, they'd probably say I was fine, always fine. And that's part of why this story happened the way it did. I've learned that when people get used to you being stable, they stop checking if you're okay. When you don't raise your voice, they assume you don't need help. When you solve problems quietly, they forget you're human. I wasn't underestimated because I was weak. I was underestimated because I was composed. This isn't a story about revenge. It's not a story about exposing villains or humiliating anyone. It's a story about how silence can be mistaken for consent, how pain can become entertainment, and how a moment that should have been private turned into something the entire internet felt entitled to consume. You may have seen stories like this before, a clip that circulates without context, a title designed to shock. In my case, the title people remember is usually some variation of, "My family live-streamed my breakdown instead of helping me." What most people don't realize is that the live stream wasn't the beginning of the damage. It was just the moment everything became visible. This story moves slowly on purpose. It starts years before the camera was turned on, back when small dismissals felt harmless and silence felt safer than conflict. It passes through a day that changed something inside me without anyone noticing. And yes, it includes the moment when the video went viral before anyone called an ambulance. But that isn't the climax, in the way people expect. It's not even the loudest part. What followed wasn't chaos. It was clarity. I'm telling this the way it actually felt from the inside. Calm on the surface, heavy underneath. I won't exaggerate details for drama. I won't assign evil where there was mostly carelessness and convenience. And I won't pretend I handled everything perfectly. I didn't. I just handled it quietly. If you're expecting screaming matches or explosive confrontations, this won't be that story. If you're looking for a neat hero and obvious villains, you won't find them here either. What you will find is the slow realization of what happens when people decide who you are without ever asking, and what it costs to finally step out of that role. I'm sharing this because many of us have lived some version of it, being useful, being overlooked, being strong, until our strength becomes an excuse for neglect. Maybe your moment didn't happen on camera, maybe it never went viral, but you know the feeling of disappearing in plain sight. Before I go on, let me ask you something gently and honestly. Have you ever been so reliable that people forgot to protect you when you needed it most? For most of my life, I wasn't someone people worried about. I was someone people relied on. In my family, I was introduced to phrases like, "Emma's got it handled," or "Ask Emma, she'll know." I was the one who remembered appointments, filled out forms, and translated emotions when conversations got tense. If there was a conflict, I smoothed it. If there was a gap, I filled it. Over time, that role stopped being something I did and became something I was. No one sat me down and assigned it. It happened quietly, the way these things always do. I was the daughter who didn't cause trouble, the sister who didn't need checking in on, the one who could be left alone because I'd figure it out. And I wore that identity well. I spoke evenly. I didn't dramatize pain. I didn't ask for more than I thought was reasonable. From the outside, I looked balanced, grounded, adult. Inside, it felt like being permanently placed on mute. When family gatherings happened, I was the organizer, not the focus. I'd arrive early to help set up, stay late to clean, and listen while others talked about their stress, their exhaustion, their problems. People spoke to me more than with me. When I did share something personal, it was often met with a quick nod, a practical suggestion, then a smooth pivot back to someone else's story. They weren't cruel. That's important. They weren't shouting over me or telling me I didn't matter. It was subtler than that. They simply assumed I was okay because I sounded okay. I learned early that expressing discomfort made people uneasy, so I learned to phrase everything calmly. I learned to say it's fine and mean I'll deal with it later. I learned that being low maintenance made life easier for everyone else and earned me a kind of quiet approval. You're so strong. You always handle things so well. I don't know how you stay so calm. Those words sound like compliments, and they were. But they were also instructions. Strength, I learned, meant not needing help. Calm meant not alarming anyone. Being dependable meant being endlessly available but rarely noticed. Over time, people stopped asking how I was doing at all. Not because they didn't care, but because my past answers had trained them not to worry. If Emma had a problem, she'd say so. If she didn't, everything must be fine. I started believing that logic. At work, I was the steady performer. Not flashy, not loud, but always delivering. I wasn't the one managers checked on when stress levels rose. I was the one they leaned on. When deadlines tightened, more work came my way. Not because I demanded it, but because I could carry it without complaint. At home, the pattern repeated. I was the emotional buffer, the one who listened without judgment, the one who could absorb tension and redistribute it gently so no one else had to feel it too sharply. And invisibility crept in through that usefulness. Not the kind where people literally ignore you, but the kind where your inner world is treated as background noise, where your reactions are read as stability instead of restraint, where your silence is interpreted as comfort rather than endurance. I didn't see it as unfair back then. I saw it as maturity. I told myself I didn't need the spotlight, that being seen wasn't as important as being reliable, that other people had bigger problems, louder pain, more obvious struggles. Mine felt quiet, manageable, something I could carry without burdening anyone. That belief became a habit, and habits, when left unexamined, become cages. By the time the story people know began, the day everything spilled into public view, I had already been practicing disappearance for years. I just didn't have the language for it yet. I thought this was what adulthood looked like, holding yourself together so well that no one notices how heavy the holding has become. Looking back now, I can see the warning signs, the way my needs were always postponed, the way concern flowed toward louder voices, the way my calm became a reason to leave me alone, even when I shouldn't have been. But at the time, I didn't feel wronged. I felt assigned. This is who Emma is. She's fine. She can handle it. And for a long time I did, until one day being the strong one stopped protecting me and started erasing me. The first moment I remember didn't feel important at the time. That's why it stayed with me. It wasn't dramatic. No raised voices, no cruel words, just a small shift. So small that if you blinked, you'd miss it, and everyone else did. It happened during a family gathering, one of those casual weekends where nothing is officially planned, but everyone expects you to be present anyway. I had been dealing with weeks of exhaustion, nothing diagnosable, nothing urgent, just a deep, unshakable fatigue that sleep didn't seem to touch. I mentioned it in passing, the way people like me do, lightly, almost apologetically. I've been feeling really worn down lately, I said. I might leave a little early. There was a pause, not an uncomfortable one, just a brief gap in the conversation before someone else spoke. You're always busy, my sister said, smiling, not unkindly. You'll be fine after some rest. Someone else laughed softly and added, Emma's always tired. She does too much. And that was it. No follow-up questions, no curiosity. No one asked why I was worn down or how long it had been going on. The conversation moved on smoothly, efficiently, like a train switching tracks without slowing down. I nodded, I smiled, I let it go. That's the thing about the first small cut. You help make it invisible. I told myself they meant well, that everyone gets tired, that it wasn't worth turning into a whole thing. I had said it casually after all. Why would anyone treat it as serious? But something inside me registered the moment differently. Not as rejection, exactly. More like a quiet data point. This is what happens when I speak softly about pain. After that, I noticed other moments like it. Not because they increased in severity, but because my awareness sharpened. I mentioned a stressful week at work. Someone responded with advice before understanding. I hinted at feeling overwhelmed. Someone reframed it as a compliment. That just means you're capable. I expressed uncertainty. Someone quickly reassured themselves on my behalf. You always figure things out. Each time the message was the same. You don't need to be held. You just need to keep going. What made it confusing was that no one was dismissive on purpose. They weren't cold, they weren't mocking. In fact, they seemed comfortable, relieved even. My calm allowed them to stay comfortable, and I participated in that comfort. I didn't correct them. I didn't say, "Actually, I'm not fine." I didn't push back when my concerns were smoothed over. I told myself this was normal adult interaction, that people don't pause everything for mild discomfort, that real emergencies sound louder than this. So I internalized the cut instead of pointing to it. I started editing myself more carefully. If I mentioned stress, I'd soften it with humor. If I admitted exhaustion, I'd follow it with reassurance. It's nothing serious. I'm just tired. I'll manage. And they believed me. The dangerous part wasn't that they ignored my pain. It was that they trusted my presentation of it. I had trained them well. There was one moment later that year when I tested something without realizing it. I was genuinely struggling. Sleep was fragmented. My chest felt tight, more often than not, and I had this constant sense of being slightly underwater. I told a family member plainly, without humor, "I'm not doing great." They looked at me surprised. Not alarmed, just surprised. "You don't look like anything's wrong," they said. It wasn't meant to be dismissive. It was observational, neutral, honest. But it landed heavily, because in that sentence was the unspoken rule I had been living by. If it doesn't show, it doesn't count. I reassured them almost immediately. I said I was just tired, that work had been busy, that it would pass. I watched their shoulders relax as I spoke. Tension left the room. Balance was restored. And something inside me learned a new lesson. If I want support, I have to perform distress. If I stay composed, I will be left alone. That realization didn't make me angry. It made me quieter. From that point on, I stopped expecting curiosity. I stopped offering incomplete truths. I became more efficient with my emotional disclosures. Short, neat, impossible to interrupt daily life with. The cut was small, but it was precise. It didn't bleed, it didn't scar. It just changed how I held myself, and no one noticed. Not because they didn't care, but because I had already taught them that Emma doesn't need catching. She always lands on her feet. I didn't know yet that those small cuts were cumulative, that each one narrowed the space where help could reach me. I just knew that something had shifted, quietly, from being unseen to being expected not to be seen. And once that expectation settles in, it becomes very hard to break. By the time I noticed the pattern clearly, it already felt normal. That's how it works. Disrespect doesn't usually arrive as a single, obvious event. It settles in gradually, disguised as familiarity, as efficiency, as we all know how this goes. I wasn't being insulted. I was being assumed. Assumed to be available, assumed to be capable, assumed to be fine. And when assumptions are comfortable, no one feels the need to question them. There were moments that should have stood out more than they did. Times when my time was volunteered without my consent. Emma can help with that. Times when decisions were made that affected me, and I was informed afterward instead of being consulted beforehand. Times when I was interrupted mid-sentence, not aggressively, just casually, like my words could wait. Each moment was small enough to excuse. Each one had a reasonable explanation. People were busy. No one meant harm. I didn't want to be difficult, so I adjusted. I learned to respond quickly so I wouldn't be talked over. I learned to preemptively say yes so there wouldn't be awkward pauses. I learned to minimize my reactions so I wouldn't disrupt the emotional flow of a room. And then something subtle happened. My silence started being treated as agreement. If I didn't object immediately, the decision stood. If I didn't express discomfort clearly, it was assumed I had none. If I didn't ask for help, it was concluded that I didn't need it. I told myself this was adulthood, that everyone compromises, that being flexible was a strength. But flexibility, when it only bends one way, becomes erosion. What made it harder to recognize was that I benefited from the role in some ways. Being reliable gave me a sense of worth. Being needed felt better than being ignored. And in moments of doubt, I could tell myself I mattered because people depended on me. But dependence is not the same as care. Care requires attention. It requires listening. Dependence only requires a function. I noticed how quickly people became uncomfortable when I didn't respond the way they expected. If I hesitated before agreeing to something, the room shifted. If I said, "Let me think about it," I was met with confusion, sometimes with mild irritation, quickly masked. It was as if my pause disrupted an unspoken contract. You handle things, you don't complicate them, you don't need extra time. So I stopped pausing. I rationalized everything. That was my specialty. I explained away my own discomfort before anyone else had to. They're under a lot of stress. It's not personal. This isn't worth addressing. I don't want to make things awkward. Each justification sounded reasonable on its own. Together, they built a quiet tolerance for being overlooked. I also started editing my memories. When something stung, I replayed it until I found a version where no one was at fault, where I had misunderstood or been overly sensitive. That way, I didn't have to confront the possibility that people were comfortable with my discomfort, because that possibility was heavier than the discomfort itself. There were times when someone else would express a boundary firmly, sometimes even abruptly, and the room would adjust instantly. Apologies would be offered, accommodations made. I watched that with a kind of detached curiosity. Not envy, more like observation. They speak, and the environment shifts. I speak, and the conversation moves on. The difference wasn't volume. It was an expectation. The expectation that their limits mattered. Mine had become optional. Still, I stayed quiet. Not because I was afraid, but because I believed staying quiet was the more mature choice. I believed that reacting would make things worse, that pointing out patterns would make me seem ungrateful or dramatic. And there was another, deeper reason I didn't want to admit yet. If I acknowledged the disrespect, I would have to acknowledge the loss of being genuinely seen, the loss of safety in places I had assumed were safe. It felt easier to normalize it, so I did what many people do when something hurts slowly. I adapted. I lowered my expectations. I stopped hoping for check-ins. I stopped waiting for someone to notice the weight I was carrying. I told myself that self-sufficiency was a virtue, that needing less was a kind of freedom. But needing less isn't freedom when the need is still there. It just means you're carrying it alone. By the time the normalization was complete, the line between respect and convenience had blurred. People treated me well, as long as I functioned as expected, as long as I didn't interrupt the rhythm, as long as I remained the version of myself that required nothing extra. And I became very good at being that version. So good, in fact, that when the moment came where I truly couldn't carry it anymore, no one recognized it as danger. They recognized it as a disruption, and they responded accordingly. But that came later. At this stage, all I knew was that the quiet dismissal had become routine, that my presence was valued for what it provided, not for what it felt, and that I had played a role in making it that way, by staying silent, by rationalizing, by calling endurance maturity. It didn't feel like betrayal yet. It felt like responsibility. The realization didn't arrive all at once. It came in fragments, assembling itself slowly until the picture became impossible to ignore. I had a role, not a title, not a label anyone said out loud, but a function that existed whether I acknowledged it or not. I was the stabilizer, the buffer, the one who made things easier for everyone else by absorbing what they didn't want to deal with. And once a role is established, people start defending it. I noticed how conversation subtly steered me back into position whenever I drifted. If I expressed frustration, someone would reframe it. If I voiced doubt, someone would reassure me instead of listening. If I set a small boundary, it was negotiated immediately, as if my limits were flexible suggestions rather than decisions. I wasn't punished for stepping out of line. I was corrected. Don't take it so seriously. You're overthinking it. That's not like you. That last one appeared often. That's not like you. As if me had already been defined, finalized, and deviation was a mistake. I started seeing myself reflected back through that narrow lens. The calm one, the capable one, the one who doesn't need much. It was strange, being told who you are by people who never asked how you feel. At family events, I was given tasks automatically. No one checked if I wanted them. It was assumed. If I completed them, things ran smoothly. If I hesitated, the air changed slightly. Not dramatically, just enough to signal inconvenience. So I learned not to hesitate. I also learned that my emotional range was expected to stay within a specific bandwidth. Calm concern was acceptable. Gentle disappointment could be tolerated briefly. Anything beyond that, confusion, sadness, anger, felt out of place in the room. Those emotions belonged to others. I was there to manage them, not add to them. It's a strange thing, realizing that the people closest to you rely on you being a certain way, more than they care about whether that way is sustainable. The role came with praise. That's how it stays in place. You're the glue. I don't know what we'd do without you. You're so easy to be around. Easy. That word lingered. Easy doesn't mean valued, it means convenient. And it was very convenient. The more reliable I was, the less room there was for me to change. The more composed I stayed, the less tolerance there was for visible struggle. It was a loop that fed itself. Every time I fulfilled the role, it became more fixed. Every time I resisted, even slightly, it was smoothed over or gently dismissed. I don't think anyone intended to trap me there. Roles like this aren't assigned with malice. They form when everyone benefits except the person inside them. And I benefited too, in my own way. I avoided conflict, I maintained peace, I felt useful. There's a certain safety in being predictable, in being needed. But predictability can become a cage when it replaces permission to be human. I remember one particular moment when this crystallized for me. Someone else in the family canceled plans at the last minute, citing emotional overwhelm. Everyone immediately rallied around them. Messages of support, offers to help, understanding. A few weeks later, I tried to do something similar. I explained calmly that I needed a break, that I was exhausted. The response was different. Disappointment, confusion, subtle pressure to reconsider. Are you sure? It's not that big of a deal. We were counting on you. No one accused me outright. They didn't need to. The message was clear. You're not the one who needs rest. You're the one others rest on. That was the role. Reliable, useful, invisible. And once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. I realized how often my value was framed in terms of what I provided, not who I was. How rarely anyone asked what I wanted without attaching it to logistics. How quickly concern for me turned into inconvenience when it interfered with expectations. This wasn't cruelty, it was conditioning. Everyone had learned that I would show up, smooth things over, and absorb the weight quietly, including me. And here's the part that's hardest to admit. I helped build the role. Every time I chose silence over honesty, every time I prioritized harmony over self-respect, every time I told myself it wasn't worth addressing, but understanding that didn't make it easier to leave. Because roles come with belonging, and stepping out of one risks being seen as difficult, selfish, or ungrateful, especially when you've been praised for being the opposite. So I stayed in it longer than I should have. I stayed until something inside me shifted, not outwardly, not dramatically, but enough that I could no longer pretend the role was harmless. That shift didn't come from a confrontation. It came from a quiet moment when I realized that if I kept playing this part, there might not be much of me left outside of it. There was no argument, no dramatic incident, no moment where someone said something unforgivable. That's what makes this shift so hard to explain. It happened on an ordinary day, in an ordinary setting, during an interaction that looked unremarkable from the outside. And yet something in me moved, quietly, decisively, into a position it would never leave again. I was sitting alone in my apartment, late afternoon light slanting across the floor. I had come home early from work. Claiming a headache, I didn't bother to medicate. The truth was harder to articulate. I felt hollowed out, like I had been running a long distance without realizing it, and had only just stopped to notice the ache. My phone buzzed with a message from a family group chat. A plan was being made. Details finalized. My name appeared in the thread, attached to a task I had not agreed to. Emma can take care of this part. I stared at the screen longer than necessary. Normally, I would have responded immediately. A simple, sure, or no problem. That reflex was ingrained. But that day, my fingers didn't move. Not out of defiance, out of something closer to exhaustion. As the messages continued, no one waited for my reply. The plan solidified around my assumed participation. I was included as a function, not a voice. And something in me finally asked a question I had been avoiding for years. What happens if I don't step in? Not in a hypothetical way, not as a thought experiment, but right now, in this moment. I imagined the mild confusion, the slight inconvenience, the scramble to redistribute responsibility. I imagined the discomfort that would ripple outward if I simply didn't respond. And for the first time, I realized how much of the system depended on my silence. That realization didn't make me angry. It made me very calm. I set the phone down, not to punish anyone, not to make a point, just to sit with the discomfort of not rescuing the situation, to see what happened when I didn't immediately smooth the edges. Minutes passed, then more messages. A question mark, a gentle nudge. Emma? I felt my chest tighten, not with fear, but with recognition. This was the moment. Not a confrontation, but a choice. I typed, deleted, and retyped. Finally, I sent a simple message. I can't do that. No explanation, no apology, no justification. The response was immediate, not hostile, but unsettled. Oh, okay. Are you sure? We kind of need you for this. Need. There it was again. I didn't reply right away. I wasn't being strategic. I was listening to myself. I noticed how my body felt. The familiar urge to fix it. The instinct to soften the blow. To say, I'll figure something out. To make it easier for everyone else. And I didn't. That was the shift. Not because I refused a task, but because I didn't rush to manage the emotional fallout of refusing it. I allowed the discomfort to exist without absorbing it. Eventually, someone else volunteered. The plan adjusted. Life went on. But I didn't feel relieved. I felt clear. Clear about how automatic my participation had been. Clear about how rare it was for me to opt out without explanation. Clear about how much of my energy had been spent maintaining a version of myself that made others comfortable. That night I sat with my notebook, the one I'd carried for years, mostly for lists and reminders. And instead of writing what needed to be done next, I wrote a single sentence. If I don't protect my limits, no one else will. It wasn't a vow. It wasn't a manifesto. It was an observation. From that day on, nothing changed immediately. I didn't announce boundaries. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't rewrite my identity overnight. But something inside me had moved from passive endurance to quiet awareness. I started noticing how often my needs were treated as optional. How quickly people adjusted when someone else said no, but hesitated when I did. How my silence had been doing more work than my words ever did. And I started asking myself a different question. Not, is this worth addressing? But, what does it cost me if I don't? That question became the lens. Through it, I could see the patterns clearly, without anger or blame, just facts. I realized I had been waiting for permission to change, waiting for someone to notice I was struggling enough to justify doing things differently. That permission wasn't coming, so I stopped waiting. The shift wasn't visible to anyone else, not yet. On the surface, I was still calm, still reliable, still present, but underneath, I had stepped out of the role, just enough to see it from the outside. And once you see the shape of the cage, you don't unsee it. After that day, my silence changed texture. Before it had been automatic, an instinctive response shaped by habit and fear of disruption. Now it was deliberate, measured, chosen. From the outside, nothing looked different. I didn't suddenly become distant or cold. I still showed up. I still spoke calmly. I still did what I agreed to do. But I stopped filling in the gaps that weren't mine. I let pauses exist. When someone asked for something, I didn't answer immediately. I said, let me check, and actually checked, with myself, not my calendar. When plans were being made, I waited to be asked instead of preemptively volunteering. When conversations drifted toward assumptions about my availability, I gently redirected them, not with confrontation, with neutrality. I can't commit to that right now. That won't work for me. I'm not available. Short sentences, no emotional cushioning. No explanations offered unless they were genuinely requested. At first, people didn't notice the change. Or rather, they noticed something but couldn't name it. The machine still ran. The output still arrived. What changed was the absence of my unpaid emotional labor. The smoothing, the anticipating, the fixing before anyone asked. That absence created friction, not conflict, friction. People hesitated more. They checked in later than usual. Sometimes, they assumed I was busy instead of assuming I would handle it. The space I left behind forced others to either step up or sit with uncertainty. And they mistook that for weakness. You seem tired lately. You okay? Just let us know if you need help. Those questions sound caring. And some of them were. But they were also framed in a familiar way, as if my change were temporary, a dip to be corrected rather than a boundary to be respected. I didn't correct them. I let them believe what they needed to believe. That was another shift, one that felt counterintuitive at first. I'd spent so long clarifying myself, translating my intentions, reassuring everyone else. Now, I let misinterpretations exist. Not out of spite, out of conservation. I realized how much energy I had spent trying to be understood by people who were comfortable misunderstanding me, as long as it kept things easy. So I stopped explaining. When someone assumed I was overwhelmed, I didn't rush to deny it. When someone thought I was pulling back because of stress, I didn't offer a narrative. I let the ambiguity sit. It gave me room. In that room, I started paying attention to things I had ignored before. Patterns, behaviors, the way certain people only reached out when they needed something. The concern appeared only when my output decreased. The way my presence was noticed most was when it disrupted expectations. None of this made me angry. It made me observant. Silence, when chosen, is a powerful filter. It reveals who is listening and who is waiting to speak, who respects pauses and who rushes to fill them, who sees you as a person and who sees you as a function. I also became more careful with what I shared. Not secretive, selective. I stopped offering personal information to people who had never shown curiosity beyond surface-level reassurance. I saved my honesty for spaces where it would be met with attention, not deflection. That selectivity felt strange at first, almost dishonest. But it wasn't dishonesty, it was discernment. I wasn't withdrawing, I was redirecting. And because I wasn't making noise about it, no one challenged me directly. There was nothing to argue with. No boundary speeches, no ultimatums. Just a steady, quiet recalibration. People adjusted in small ways. Some unconsciously, some with mild resistance, a few with confusion that edged toward irritation. But no one confronted me, because from their perspective, nothing was wrong. And that was exactly the point. Silence had stopped being something that happened to me. It had become something I used, not to manipulate, but to observe, to choose, to protect. It gave me time. Time to think, time to plan, time to understand the systems I was part of and my position within them. I wasn't preparing for revenge. I wasn't building a case. I was learning where my energy actually went, and who noticed when it stopped flowing freely. This phase didn't feel empowering in a dramatic way. It felt grounded, quiet, almost boring. But beneath that calm, something was taking shape. I was no longer the person who automatically absorbed everything to keep the peace. I was becoming someone who allowed others to experience the natural consequences of their assumptions. And once silence becomes a choice, it stops being a sign of weakness. It becomes a line. While everything looked the same on the surface, a lot was changing underneath. That's the part no one ever notices. What happens when the quiet person stops reacting and starts observing? Because I wasn't filling every gap anymore, I suddenly had time, mental space, energy that wasn't immediately spent on maintenance. And with that space came clarity. I began to see patterns not just in people, but in systems. I noticed how responsibilities circulated, who was assumed to pick them up, who was protected from them, and who was praised for doing the bare minimum. I noticed how information flowed unevenly, how decisions were made before conversations happened, how certain narratives were repeated until they felt like the truth. And I started documenting, not obsessively, not emotionally, just accurately. Dates, conversations, commitments that shifted without notice, moments where my words were acknowledged and then quietly ignored. I didn't write with the intention of using it against anyone. I wrote because I wanted to understand what was real and what I had been rationalizing away. Memory can be generous to other people at our own expense. Writing removes that generosity. I also began learning about boundaries, about burnout, about family dynamics that reward compliance and punish deviation without ever raising their voice. I read quietly, listened carefully, compared notes with myself. What struck me most was how predictable everything became once I stopped personalizing it. This wasn't about me being insufficient or overly sensitive. It was about being efficient, about systems preferring stability over fairness, about how people don't question what works for them. That understanding gave me distance. At the same time, I started adjusting my practical life. Again, quietly. I reviewed my finances, making sure there were no dependencies I had minimized. I ensured my accounts, documents, and responsibilities were clearly separated and fully under my control. Not out of fear, but out of respect for myself. I also paid attention to how often I was the emotional first responder, how quickly people reached for me when things felt uncomfortable, and how rarely they stayed present when my discomfort surfaced. So I stopped being immediately available, not dramatically, not with announcements, just with pacing. Delayed replies, thoughtful responses instead of instant ones, presence that was intentional rather than automatic. What surprised me was how little resistance there was. People adjusted faster than I expected. Tasks found new homes. Conversations moved on without me. The world did not collapse in my absence. That was both relieving and sobering. It told me two things at once. I had been overfunctioning, and I had been underseen. No one noticed the work I stopped doing, because it had never been acknowledged as work in the first place. They didn't notice the emotional labor I withdrew. They didn't notice the quiet preparations I was making. They didn't notice the way I was repositioning myself internally and externally, because they weren't looking at me closely. They never had. That invisibility, once painful, became an advantage. I could move without commentary, adjust without scrutiny, learn without interference. While others assumed nothing was wrong, or that I was simply tired, I was becoming precise, not colder, clearer. I wasn't planning a reveal. I wasn't counting down to a moment. I was building stability where I had once substituted endurance. And the more grounded I became, the less I needed validation from the people who had benefited most from my silence. They never noticed the shift because it didn't inconvenience them yet, but it was coming. Not as a punishment, not as a threat, just as a natural outcome of stepping out of a role that had quietly depended on my disappearance. And by the time they did notice, the groundwork would already be laid. The reveal didn't come from someone confessing or a secret being exposed. It came from understanding something I had already been living inside of. One evening, while reviewing my notes, nothing dramatic, just patterns laid out over time, I noticed how consistently one thing showed up: responsibility without authority, expectation without protection, visibility only when something went wrong or didn't get done. It wasn't personal, it was structural, and that's when the leverage became clear. Not leverage over people, but over my own position. I realized that a significant amount of emotional and logistical stability in my family's ecosystem flowed through me, quietly, unacknowledged, unrewarded. I wasn't central because I was powerful. I was central because I was dependable. And dependability, when withdrawn thoughtfully, changes everything. That was the private reveal. I wasn't trapped. I was embedded. There's a difference. Trapped means no exit. Embedded means no one notices how integral you are until you step back. I also realized something else. Equally important, no one had explicitly asked me to carry as much as I had. I had stepped into the gaps early, and the system had grown around that shape, which meant stepping out didn't require permission. It required consistency. I sat with that for a long time. Not in triumph, not in anger, just stillness. This wasn't about proving a point. It wasn't about making anyone feel guilty. It was about reclaiming authorship over my own life, without needing an audience. I stopped waiting for acknowledgement. I stopped hoping someone would suddenly understand. I stopped imagining conversations where everything would be explained and resolved cleanly. Clarity replaced hope, and clarity is quieter than people expect. Once I saw the system clearly, my next steps weren't emotional. They were practical. I knew exactly what I would stop doing, what I would continue doing, and what I would never explain again. I didn't announce the reveal because it wasn't for them. It was for me. The power wasn't in confrontation, it was in alignment. And from that moment on, every decision became easier. Not because it was painless, but because it was honest. I wasn't preparing to disappear. I was preparing to exist on my own terms. Once you see the system clearly, you can't stay neutral inside it. That's the part no one tells you. Awareness demands a response. Not immediately, not dramatically, but inevitably. I reached a point where continuing as I was felt like an active choice, not a default. And that meant I had to decide what kind of discomfort I was willing to live with. There were options. I could have confronted everyone at once, laid out the patterns, explained how invisible I had felt, asked for change. That path was tempting in its clarity. It promised catharsis, maybe even validation, but it also relied on something I no longer trusted: other people's willingness to understand. Another option was to fade quietly, pull back emotionally, reduce contact, minimize my presence, protect myself by disengaging. That would have been clean, efficient, and largely unnoticed. But that felt like erasure wearing a different mask. The third option was slower, less visible, irreversible in a way that didn't require permission or applause. I could change my participation, not by disappearing, not by confronting, but by restructuring my life so that my well-being no longer depended on staying in that role. That option scared me the most, because it meant letting go of the identity I had been praised for. It meant allowing people to be disappointed. It meant becoming someone who could be misunderstood without rushing to correct it. And it meant accepting that some relationships might not survive the change. Not because they were malicious, but because they were built around access to me. I took time with the decision. Weeks, not days. I paid attention to my body when I imagined each path. The confrontational version felt volatile. The disappearing version felt hollow. The restructuring felt steady. So I chose it, quietly, completely, without announcement. That was the irreversible choice, not a single act, but a commitment to stop sacrificing myself to preserve systems that didn't protect me. Once that decision was made, everything that followed had direction. I wasn't reacting anymore. I was moving. And movement, even slow movement, changes things. Once the decision was made, I didn't feel urgency. I felt patience. That surprised me. I had expected momentum to come with adrenaline, with the need to do something immediately. Instead, what arrived was steadiness, the kind that doesn't rush because it knows where it's going. Moving in silence doesn't mean doing nothing. It means doing things that don't require witnesses. I began with the practical, the unglamorous, the parts of life that quietly determine how much freedom you actually have. I reviewed my finances in detail, not because anything was wrong, but because I needed to know exactly where I stood. I consolidated accounts, updated beneficiaries, and removed informal arrangements that had once seemed harmless. I made sure that nothing essential in my life depended on someone else's goodwill or availability. There was no drama in that process, just paperwork, spreadsheets, decisions made without discussion. I also adjusted my time. I stopped structuring my schedule around everyone else's needs and started building it around my capacity. That meant declining things I would have previously rearranged my life to accommodate. It meant choosing rest without justifying it. It meant allowing empty space in my calendar without feeling guilty. No one commented on these changes at first, because from the outside, it didn't look like a rebellion. It looked like busyness, or tiredness, or a phase. I let them think that. At work, I refined my boundaries the same way. I stopped taking on tasks that weren't part of my role. I documented responsibilities clearly. I followed procedures instead of compensating for their absence. When something wasn't mine to fix, I didn't fix it. That alone shifted more than I expected, not because I said anything, but because I stopped covering for inefficiencies that had quietly relied on me. Problems became visible. Timelines stretched. Others had to engage where I had once absorbed the impact. Still, no one accused me of anything. There was nothing to accuse. I was doing my job. I was fulfilling my responsibilities. I just wasn't doing everyone else's. In my personal life, the changes were even quieter. I shared less. Not out of secrecy, but out of self-respect. I stopped offering access to my inner world, where it hadn't been honored before. When conversations turned toward expectation, I didn't argue. I restated facts. I'm not available. I won't be able to help with that. I've already made other plans. No elaboration, no apologies. Some people adjusted smoothly. Others hesitated, as if waiting for the version of me that would soften and step back into place. She didn't return. And because I wasn't making a spectacle of the shift, there was no clear moment for anyone else to react. No confrontation to prepare for. No speech to refute. Just a gradual absence of what they had quietly depended on. What they didn't see was how intentional it all was. How every small adjustment is connected to the same decision point. How each boundary reinforced the next. I wasn't withdrawing emotionally. I was redistributing energy away from maintenance towards stability. This phase wasn't empowering in the cinematic sense. There were no victories to celebrate, no one to prove wrong. Just the quiet work of aligning my actions with the truth I had already accepted. And that kind of work doesn't announce itself. It just accumulates. By the time anyone realized something had changed, the infrastructure of my life was already different, more solid, less negotiable, and there would be no easy way to put me back where I had been. The consequences didn't arrive like a storm. They arrived in silence where something used to be. At first it was subtle, A missed reminder, a task that went unfinished longer than expected, a plan that felt oddly disorganized without anyone quite knowing why. I noticed before anyone else did. That wasn't new. I had always noticed first. The difference now was that I didn't step in. Someone forgot an important detail and scrambled at the last minute. Another person took on something they clearly weren't prepared for and became stressed. Conversations circled the same problem repeatedly without resolution. I watched all of it with a strange mix of detachment and clarity. Not satisfied, not resentment, just recognition. This is what I used to absorb. People began feeling the absence before they identified the source. They experienced it as an inconvenience, as inefficiency, as things being off lately. They spoke about it in vague terms. Things feel more chaotic than usual. I don't know why this keeps falling through. Someone needs to coordinate this better. Someone. They still didn't say my name. That was the most telling part. Even as the system strained, they didn't immediately connect it to me. Because my work had never been visible as work. It had been treated as background stability, like lighting in a room, only noticeable when it flickers. And when it flickered, the instinct wasn't gratitude. It was irritation. I started receiving messages that carried a new tone. Still polite, still calm, but edged with expectation. Hey, quick question, can you help with this? We're kind of stuck. Any ideas? Do you know what's going on here? They weren't reaching out to check on me. They were reaching out to restore balance. I answered selectively. Sometimes I said no. Sometimes I said, I'm not sure. Sometimes I didn't reply right away. And when I did help, I helped within clear limits. Advice instead of action. Suggestions instead of execution. That shift frustrated some people more than a flat refusal would have, because advice requires effort on their part. Execution had always been mine. I could feel the confusion building, not loud enough to become a confrontation, but present. A sense that something had changed without an explanation. That the old rhythms no longer worked. A few people tried a different approach. They softened their tone, checked in more warmly. You've seemed a bit distant. Everything okay with you? We miss having you around as much. Those words might have landed differently once. Now they felt like signals. Not of concern, but of loss of function. I responded honestly, but minimally. I'm doing well. I've just been focusing on my own things. Nothing's wrong, because nothing was wrong. What they were experiencing wasn't a problem. It was an adjustment. But adjustments are uncomfortable when you've benefited from someone else carrying the weight. I also noticed who didn't reach out at all, who adapted without complaint, who stepped up quietly, without commentary or resentment. Those observations mattered. They showed me which relationships had elasticity and which had only existed in a narrow range of usefulness. Still, I didn't confront anyone. There was nothing to accuse them of. I hadn't been wronged in a way that demanded justice. I had simply stopped overextending. And yet the consequences kept unfolding. Plans took longer. Emotions ran hotter. Responsibilities felt heavier to the people now carrying them. I watched as others experienced a fraction of what I had normalized for years, and struggled with it. That wasn't vindication. It was confirmation. Confirmation that my limits had never been unreasonable. That the system had worked because I had made myself smaller, quieter, and more flexible than was sustainable. And now that I wasn't, the imbalance was visible, not because I pointed it out, but because it could no longer be hidden. By the time the panic surfaced, it was already too late to fix things the old way. That's the nature of quiet systems. They don't fail loudly at first. They fray, they stretch, they hold until they don't. The tension had been building for weeks. Missed details, fractured communication, small crises that felt disproportionately exhausting to the people now handling them. I could sense the rising urgency in messages, the subtle escalation in tone. Not anger, concern. And concern, when it arrives late, often looks like control. People began checking in more frequently, not to listen, but to assess, to gauge whether the old structure could be restored. Can we talk? Something feels off. We need to get back to how things used to work. Used to work. I understood what they meant. Life had been smoother when I absorbed the friction, when I smoothed transitions, when I managed the emotional undercurrent without naming it. What they didn't understand was that that version had been running on borrowed energy. I was tired in a way that rest didn't solve anymore. My body had been sending signals for months, headaches that lingered, sleep that fractured, a heaviness behind my eyes that no amount of calm breathing could lift. I had acknowledged it privately, adjusted my life accordingly, and believed I was managing it. But stress doesn't always recede just because you step back. Sometimes it waits for a quieter moment to speak. The day it happened was not dramatic at first. It was a family gathering again, routine, familiar, full of unspoken expectations. Someone suggested recording part of it live, casually, the way people do now. A moment to share, to include others. I didn't object. I rarely did. I remember feeling slightly disconnected, like my body was a few seconds behind the room. Sounds felt sharp, lights too bright. My chest tightened in a way that felt new and wrong. I tried to excuse myself. I said I needed air. Someone laughed lightly. "You're fine. Sit for a minute." The camera stayed on. What followed wasn't a scream or a collapse. It was quieter than that. My words slowed. My hands shook. I couldn't seem to get a full breath. I remember saying, very calmly, "I don't feel okay." No one recognized it as a danger. They recognized it as discomfort. Someone adjusted the angle of the phone. Someone else tried to talk me through it, like it was a momentary wobble. "Breathe. You're okay. Just anxiety." I wasn't okay, but years of my calm had trained them to treat my distress as manageable, as something that would pass, if not made into a big deal. And so it was streamed. My breakdown, if you can even call it that, wasn't loud enough to alarm them. It didn't match their image of an emergency. It looked controlled, articulate, contained. The camera kept rolling. What no one realized was that control was the last thing holding me together. And when it slipped, it did so without spectacle. I don't remember falling. I remember sitting down, then the floor being closer than it should have been. I remember someone saying my name like a question. The live stream didn't end immediately. Later I would learn that the video went viral before anyone called an ambulance. Shared, clipped, and commented on by strangers interpreting my body language like a puzzle, diagnosing me, judging me, debating whether I was overreacting. But in that room, in that moment, the panic came not from what was happening to me, but from the realization that no one knew what to do without the version of me that fixed things. They were trying to put the structure back together while it was actively failing. Someone finally called for help when I stopped responding the way they expected, when my calm deserted me completely, when there was no reassuring language left to lean on. By then, the old system was gone. The consequences weren't just medical. They were relational, existential. Because once something like that happens in public, once the internet sees what the people closest to you minimized, there's no pretending it was just a phase. No, reframing it as fatigue. No smoothing it over. The truth was visible now, not because I exposed it, because it collapsed. And all the late concern in the world couldn't undo the years of quiet dismissal that led there. The confrontation didn't happen in a single moment. There was no hospital room explosion, no raised voices, no list of grievances delivered through clenched teeth. That surprised everyone, including me. By the time I was physically stable again, something inside me had settled into a quiet stillness. Not numbness, not forgiveness, just clarity without urgency. People expected anger, or tears, or at least questions. I didn't have any. The first real conversation happened days later, in a living room that felt unfamiliar, despite being the same one I'd sat in countless times before. The energy was different, cautious, heavy with things no one knew how to say. Someone started with apologies, awkward overlapping ones. We didn't realize. We thought you were okay. We would never have done that if we knew. I listened. I didn't interrupt. Not because I was trying to be gracious, but because I was curious. Curious about where responsibility would land. Most of what I heard was framed around shock, around how scary it had been for them, around how quickly things had escalated, around how the internet had misunderstood. Very little of it was about why no one recognized danger until it became undeniable. When there was a pause, someone finally asked carefully, "Why didn't you say something sooner?" The question was gentle, but it carried an assumption. I answered just as gently, "I did. That was it." I didn't list examples. I didn't reference years of minimization. I didn't mention the small cuts or the normalized dismissal. I didn't bring up the live stream. I didn't need to. The silence after that was long. Then someone said, "We didn't think it was that serious." "I know," I replied. That was the closest thing to confrontation there was. Because what else was there to argue about? Intent wasn't the issue. Patterns were. and patterns don't dissolve just because people feel bad when they finally see them. I explained a few things, not defensively, not emotionally, just factually, that I wouldn't be resuming the role I used to play, that I would need distance while I recovered, that some boundaries weren't temporary. I didn't threaten consequences. I didn't ask for understanding. I stated realities. The calm unsettled them more than anger would have. There was no emotional heat to react to, no accusation to refute, just a version of me that wasn't managing their feelings anymore. Someone asked if things could go back to normal. I paused, not for effect, but because the word didn't fit. This is normal now, I said. No bitterness, no edge, just truth. That was when I realized something important. Confrontation doesn't require force when the decision has already been made. I wasn't asking for change. I was informing them of it. And because there was no performance, no collapse, no rage, no pleading, they had nothing to negotiate with, only themselves. Recovery didn't turn me into someone louder. If anything, it made me quieter in a different way. I didn't emerge with a new persona or a dramatic sense of rebirth. There were no declarations about cutting people off or starting over. What changed was simpler and more difficult to reverse. I stopped living as a function. Who I am now is less defined by usefulness and more by presence. I don't anticipate needs that aren't expressed. I don't volunteer for roles I didn't choose. I don't translate my boundaries into comfort for others. That doesn't make me cold, it makes me accurate. My relationships look different now. Some are fewer, some are slower. A few became stronger once they adjusted to the absence of my overextension. Others faded, not in conflict, but in quiet distance. I let them. That was one of the hardest parts, allowing relationships to change without trying to preserve them at my own expense. I had to learn that not everything that ends does so because of failure. Some things end because they were built on an imbalance. I no longer measure my worth by how indispensable I am. I measure it by how sustainable my life feels. There are still days when old instincts surface, when I feel the pull to step in, smooth things over, rescue the moment. I notice it now. I pause. I decide. Most of the time I choose myself, not in a grand way, in a practical one. I rest before I'm exhausted. I speak before resentment builds. I decline without explanation. The people who are still in my life have learned to meet me there. Not perfectly, not always comfortably, but honestly. And the quiet dominance people sometimes ask me about, it isn't control over others. It's control over my participation. That kind of power doesn't announce itself. It doesn't need to. It's visible in consistency, in limits that don't waver, in calm that isn't performative. I don't carry anger about what happened. Anger would imply I'm still asking for something. I'm not. I have what I need now. Clarity, autonomy, space, and a self that exists even when no one is watching. There's a version of this story that could end with outrage, with blame, with a list of everything that went wrong and who should have known better. That version might feel satisfying for a moment. It might even feel just, but it wouldn't be honest. What happened to me wasn't the result of one cruel decision or one malicious person. It was the result of a long pattern that everyone, including me, participated in because it worked. Until it didn't. That's the part I want to leave you with. Most harm doesn't begin as harm. It begins as convenience, as silence that keeps the peace, as a strength that becomes an expectation, as reliability that turns into entitlement. And when someone has been fine for long enough, people stop listening to anything else. The lesson here isn't don't trust anyone. It's not cut people off the moment they disappoint you. And it's definitely not wait until you break to be taken seriously. The lesson is quieter than that. Pay attention to who benefits from your silence. Notice who adjusts when you set limits, and who resists. Ask yourself whether the version of you that everyone loves is one you can sustain, because being needed is not the same as being cared for, and being strong is not the same as being safe. If you recognize yourself in any part of this story, I hope you don't wait for a public collapse or a dramatic moment to reconsider how much you're carrying. You don't owe anyone proof of pain before you protect yourself. And if you're someone who relies on the strong one in your life, maybe this is an invitation too, to check in before the silence becomes dangerous, to listen when discomfort is expressed softly, to treat calm as communication, not confirmation. I didn't lose my voice when everything went viral. I realized I never needed to raise it. Thank you for staying with this story. I'm curious. Have you ever been the person everyone depended on until you couldn't anymore? If you feel comfortable sharing, I'd like to hear your experience in the comments.
Video của mình hôm nay đến đây là kết thúc. Nếu bạn thích video này, hãy cho mình xin một lượt like và một lượt đăng ký kênh. Hẹn gặp lại các bạn ở trong những video tiếp theo. Bye bye.